First, it said Russell was hired to teach mathematics, logic, and the philosophy of science. And what he says and does in the public arena is totally irrelevant to what goes on in his classroom. Well, each of these defenses had their problems. An honest look at Russell's writings, his social writings, which I've read, and juxtaposing them next to what the judge cited shows, in fact, Russell was guilty of many of the accusations leveled against him. His views were very unorthodox, and in fact, you could say, for his time, his views were outrageous. So that defense, although honorable, was, in my opinion, not entirely honest. Russell, I think, took the higher ground. In his own defense, he said, "I claim two things: that appointments to academic posts should be made by people with some competence to judge a man's technical qualifications, the professional autonomy." And then the second defense was, two, in extra professional hours outside the university, a teacher should be free to express his opinions, whatever they may be. He didn't entirely deny that the rendering of his opinions was altogether false. And in the famous letter to the New York Times, which did not support Russell, he wrote, "In a democracy, it is necessary that people should learn to endure having their sentiments outraged." But honestly, candidly, trying to be realistic, is this the case? I read through a book called The Bertrand Russell Case. It was collected by Dewey and another prominent scholar at the time, Horace Callan. And there were many of these very elevated, stirring, thrilling defenses of academic freedom. But then there was one by a superintendent of schools somewhere in Wichita, Kansas. And to my thinking, what he had to write was the most sensible. His article was entitled, "The Case," meaning the Bertrand Russell case, "as a school administrator sees it, as a dean sees it, as a provost sees it, as a president sees it." And this is what he wrote. I would like to just quote at length, but you'll see the point. "Should a professor limit himself or be limited? The strongest advocates of academic freedom are likely to answer no. Such absolutism, however, is theoretical. It is not realistic. As a reductio ad absurdum, think of trying to retain on any faculty teachers who openly advocate homosexuality or the assassination of the president. There is always a limit. Of course, nowadays on some faculties, those two are preconditions for getting tenure. And he goes on to say, "The teacher who thinks that this limit does not apply to him is not facing reality. The administrator must necessarily take this fact into account in employing and retaining faculty members. He must recognize that neither students nor the public will separate a man's teachings in one field, Russell on philosophy, logic, and science, from his general teachings, his statements in class, from his public pronouncements, his philosophy from his life. He must recognize that And here I have to say I agree. He must recognize that, whether or not it ought to be so, students and public consider that the appointment of a teacher places a stamp of approval on him as a whole. It invests him with a prestige which seems to justify youth, my students, in considering him an example whom it might be well to follow. The teacher must be considered in his entirety. This does not mean he must be a plaster saint, but it means that his assets must clearly outweigh his liabilities. I think, speaking as somebody who's taught at many places over a sustained period of time, I think that's a reasonable statement. And then the question becomes, what are the proper limits of civility? What are those boundaries or limits which any professor has to respect? Let me just emphasize a preliminary point. What I'm about to speak about has nothing whatever to do with what goes on inside the classroom. Inside the classroom, as my students know, I am quite conservative and old-fashioned. It is not a soapbox. It's not a lectern for propagandizing and indoctrinating and towing a party line. And I always like the line by Plato. He says, the object of education is to teach us to love what is beautiful. John Cardinal Newman, he said, the university educates the intellect to reason well in all matters, to reach out toward truth, and to grasp it. And in my mind, that's right. In the classroom, your responsibility is, as a teacher, to stimulate. At a public lecture, it's very different. It's to convince. If I'm invited somewhere to speak, it's because people want to hear my point of view. But that's not why students take my class. And that's my responsibility, is to respect that limit. So what I'm about to say now bears strictly on the public realm, because at any rate, in my personal case, the issue of my conduct in the classroom never arose. First of all, there are many statements which have the appearance of incivility, but are factually accurate. My very close friend and comrade, I like that word still, Alan Dershowitz, a brilliant investigative reporter, he was on Charlie Rose one night with Elliot Abrams. And he said to Elliot Abrams that you're a war criminal. And you deserve to be charged under Nuremberg statutes. He was referring to Elliot Abrams's presiding over the mass slaughters in Central America in the 1980s and the genocide in Guatemala. Now, that's a factual statement, whether or not under the Nuremberg statutes you would be guilty of war crimes. That is not an ad hominem. If Milosevic had said at his trial that I oppose ad hominems because you're calling me a war criminal, he would be laughed out of court. Well, he wouldn't get out of court. But that's not an ad hominem attack, and that's not uncivil. It's a factual question. Similarly, if I were to call a professor a plagiarist, a falsifier of documents, a hoaxer, these words are not ad hominem. They define academic crimes and misdemeanors which can be proven true or false.